And we are live with the special members audio dialogue Vidchat with Walter Bosley. And let's do the traditional doff of the hat to everybody in the chat room. I want to say hello to everybody. We have Ramura, a cult fan, Blake Cosmos, Scorpio 58 joining us from Norway, Dogman, Geiger, Down Under ET joining us Australia, Chime, Heart Eye, K Tower, BSG joining us all the way from Nairobi, Kenya, Arthur, Megalithic Yard, Eudemonist, D Har, Freefall also in Australia, Roger, Blake Cosmos, Generic Pagan, Just a Whoa Man, Kriston Thomas, June, JC, Derek, Mogar, Keeley of Elysium in the United Kingdom, Ben Farrell, Time Dilation, Anti-Technocrat, Elixir So, Mirror 13, Icon 66, Wolfgang, June, RB44, RBG, J Trout, and Black Empty Set. So there we go. Welcome to everybody for this special dialogue vid chat. We've got 42 in the chat room. Walter, how are you doing?
I'm exhausted.
Well, listen, doff the hat, Walter.
Thank you.
I told you this was going to be historical megatonnage. And
it's that.
Yeah, it's that, Walter. That's putting it mildly. So before we get started, now, folks, I know some of you have sent in questions, but folks, I got to tell you, you're way off the mark on this one. And Walter, I read this book, and Walter. I gotta tell you, it's not only one of those page-turning books, it's fun to read, folks. I got to tell you, it's fun to read. So let's get started. First question, or first thing I want you to comment about, and that is, I've noticed in your books that you're taking a very unique approach, and especially with this, that and I'm trying to summarize the methodology here, and it seems to me that you're doing something very unique in historiography, and I'm using the academic term because what you're doing, it strikes me, you're using ordinary sources that everybody has had available for decades now, especially in this book.
Yeah.
And what you're doing, it seems to me, is you're doing a kind of intelligence analyst's analysis of that information. In other words, if I'm getting your methodology wrong here, please correct me. But if that's accurate, please comment on your methodology, particularly in this. But don't mention the book yet.
Right. Well, particularly, I think what you're talking about, and thank you. I think I do this in all my books. What you're talking about in this particular series, the Secret Mission series, of course, what I'm doing is looking at, really, like you said, what we know and what's available.
Right.
Particularly in this particular case, as you know, what is available, what has been available, but has either been flat out ignored.
Oh, totally.
Or spun a completely different way to suit a particular agenda, which we will discuss. But like you said, I look at the stuff that's been out there, and I kind of see it. And usually what happens is there's one little element that sets me off, that from my perspective, I say, hey, whoa, wait a minute. Okay, there's something going on here that they either we don't know about, or they haven't been pointing to. And then, yeah, that's, you described it right. I do go through, it's honestly rare that I will use any kind of obscure source,
Right.
On this. So,
Well, yeah.
and I hope that brings some, gravitas to the things that I'm saying.
Well, in this book, you're talking about bloodlines, esoteric interests,
Mhm.
and my favorite of them all, body doubles. And it would take someone with an intelligence background to look at all of this information and completely turn everybody's analysis upside down and say, whoa, folks, you guys are missing it. So I personally think, doff my hat again, I personally think, especially with this book, you're starting a new trend in historiography that I would personally like to see more of. So let's go ahead and just lay it all out there, Walter.
Okay.
Give us the title of the new book, and we'll dive right in.
Well, if anyone's been paying close attention, about 60 seconds or so before I logged on here, I posted a video on my Facebook, and I said, play it loud. And I will say that video I watched numerous times while working on this book, because it captures the essence, the true essence of the man I have been obsessively researching for literally the last year, because it was a year ago that I was visiting you, Joseph, that I found a particular book. And I have ended up with Secret Missions 4, The Esoteric Napoleon.
Oh, here. I love it. I love it. Napoleon Bonaparte. And folks, 400 pages of rock'em sock'em fun reading. So let's dive right in. There's 3 areas you concentrate on in this book. Bloodlines, Napoleon's family, and I want to get into that just a little bit, as far as you want to take the details about his father and his mother. And then you talk about his galloping esoteric interests, and you completely reinterpret the whole Egyptian expedition that most people, myself included, have tended to write off to the influence of Maurice Talleyrand de Perigord, his foreign minister. And I know you have a lot to say about that character. Nope. And then you end up with what to me is just the pièce de résistance in the body double substitution business. that is a real eye-opener, folks. All right, so let's start with bloodlines. What's so unusual about Napoleon Bonaparte, and why in your book do you concentrate on the whole Napoleonic Wars period as being a struggle against oligarchy?
Well, I'll say this, and this is a general statement about this research, including the bloodline stuff and everything we're going to talk about and everything that's in the book. But if you guys recall the scene in the movie Jaws where Richard Dreyfuss first comes there and he's in the medical examiner's office,
right,
and he's looking at these body parts, and he says, "This was no boating accident." That's how I felt when I looked at the life of Napoleon Bonaparte. I said, this is not what we've been told for 200 years.
Right.
We've been lied to. And the crux of it, the reason is because the threat he posed primarily because of his bloodline. What I think I have discovered in my analysis of now we're talking, I read 7 biographical books and then consulted several others. I either read or consulted over 5,000 pages on Napoleon Bonaparte. I read 1, 2, 3, 4 just pure biographies. So this is information. Some of the oldest biographies I've read dated back to contemporaries from his lifetime.
Right.
And I read the Sir Walter Scott biography, and then 3 of them have been researched and published in the last 20 years. One of them just 5 years ago. And so I got the full gamut and the benefit of a full 200-year scope and spectrum of what we know about Napoleon Bonaparte.
Yes.
So again, like you said earlier, going into this, I looked at what we know, what's there, and what I saw was something that I think, and what I found has been mostly ignored for the 200 years, or diverted from.
Right.
And these are questions about the fact that there was a question about who his father was.
Right.
It was probably Carlo Bonaparte, who changed his name to Charles Bonaparte, was not likely Napoleon's father.
Right.
The man who is often pointed to, the Comte de Marbouf, he was not likely Napoleon's real father either. And to take it the next step, what we're talking about here is the first 4 children of Letizia Bonaparte, were not Carlo's kids.
Right.
The first 2
Joseph and Napoleon. Yeah,
and
the
then
first
there was
2.
Joseph.
Right.
And then there was Napoleon, and for reasons we'll get into this later.
Right.
But Napoleon and Joseph looked strikingly like each other, and the rest of the kids that I do believe were Carlo and Letizia's kids together didn't look so much like the 2 older boys. So that kind of jumped out at me from the beginning when I was looking at the paintings, the images of all these people.
Right.
The other thing I have to say too on the imagery is, all I've ever seen all my life in movies, TV, history books, cartoons, whatever, is this short, fat, glum, balding guy, who was just grim and a megalomaniac. I had no idea until I started looking at all the paintings and reading the books that this was a young, slender, good-looking guy who was a charmer with the ladies. He had a very good sense of humor about himself too. He was not the glum, middle-aged, pot-bellied guy, which is the image we're constantly given until really probably maybe the last third of his life.
Right.
As we know it. So that right there, between the issue of, gosh, who was his father? Gosh, why do he and his brother not look like the other kids? And wow, here's a guy who is nothing like the image we're given. What's going on here? And I realize I just meandered off the bloodline thing because I'm trying to not go. I don't want to give too many of the eggs away.
Not yet.
Not yet, anyway. And but it was what got me into the bloodline. Indeed, were these things as to why the discrepancy between what we're told and what clearly the reported facts are, even by his critics.
Okay, so let's boil it down. You discovered hints and clues that his bloodline is very, very unusual, and let's say potentially very ancient. So what is it exactly about that bloodline that would have put him in the target zone, so to speak, of pretty much everybody else, every other imperial and royal house in Europe?
Yeah. The key, and I think this goes back, I've unmeandered, this goes back and actually better answers your first question as well as this one. The key here is, why were they so opposed to this man? Why the caricature? Why the propaganda about him? Yes, he was a brilliant military commander. I think we know that. To this day, he is studied. He was an artilleryman, which I know you appreciate. And he was just a master at that. But still, with a strong, large enough force, if he were just that, he could have been, if not defeated sooner, or as eventually he was, maybe he could have been bought out or something. If he were just a military genius, they would have, dealt with him quicker than they did. He was also, though, a genius at other things. And there's a clue right there, I think, to this genealogy, because his genius started at a very young age. And the things he was interested in, he was fascinated with ancient history. He was obsessed with science and technology, and of course, things of a hermetical nature interested him very much. So, you from childhood. So you're looking at somebody who, from childhood, he was a prodigy type. He was the type that they were, there's something about this kid. Now, as I found out, as I present, I think not only was he, I'm going to say it here, and we'll get into it, of course. I think he was the product of special breeding.
Okay.
Is really what I get to. He was watched in childhood. He was vetted.
Yes.
At a young age by a particular group of guys who, for lack of a better term, they're philosopher scientists. That's essentially what they were. So here you have this kid who was watched and was showing signs of brilliance, and it seemed like he couldn't make a wrong move, and he had he clearly had people in the background that were on his side. And then as he starts to win battles and just cut a swath through Italy and other parts of Europe, he sets off alarm bells of essentially the House of Este, and all their dynasties in Germany, throughout France, and of course in England. And even then, before he goes to Egypt, he could have been. You would think he could have been stopped if he had been just this or just that, but he seemed to kind of have a blessed nature.
Well, let me stop you right there. You mentioned the House of Este, and folks, let's just recall that the House of Este, Este, is connected to Venice. It's connected to the Hanoverian house that ultimately rules England. Queen Victoria herself did, as I've mentioned in some of these vidchats years ago, did a genealogical study and, wanted to show how deeply she was entwined with the House of Este. So in other words, what you're suggesting is that it is this house primarily that he comes up against, that is opposed to him and is propagandizing, the idea of the tyrant that's a short, balding, pudgy man. So what in his bloodline gave them such offense?
Well, the issue I said that put him on the radar, I believe, was when he went after Venice.
Right.
He went after Venice with a vengeance.
Yes, he did.
And what's very interesting is when you look at the man who was supposed to be his father, but particularly his mother. This is a guy. Oh, here's something a lot of people don't realize right off the bat, folks. Napoleon Bonaparte was born Napoleone Bonaparte on Corsica. He's Italian. He was never French.
Right.
He's Italian born. His mother was of the patrician families. Now,
right.
Patrician means their name is in the Golden Book of Treviso, and even his father's name was in there as well. They were their connection to that. They were in Florence, the Bonapartes, when they got that connection. The Ramolinos were from they were a Lombard family, the region of Italy where it's now what we call Tuscany and such. So he comes from the father, who I think was just his guardian. They come from a patrician family with a very interesting connection to the I apologize if I don't pronounce this right, the condottieri, which we'll talk about, and on both sides, his guardian father and his mother's side. So here you have this guy who we're told is of minor nobility.
And yet his family and his mother is in the Golden Book in Venice.
The family's in the Golden Book, and you're thinking, minor. It doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't.
And that's what popped up on my radar was there's something not making sense here. There's something in his background that cutting to the chase in a little bit, gives him the audacity to be going for what he's going for and who he's going after, and B, that puts him on their serious radar. Basically, I had the suspicion that somebody in the House of Este knew something about Napoleon Bonaparte that we have not been taught in school for the last 200 years. Something that I think Napoleon himself knew at some point, of course, in his life, and was pursuing before he went to Egypt.
And his invasion of Venice, and basically, it was Napoleon Bonaparte, let's recall, folks, that shut the serene Republic of Venice down. It ceases to be a sovereign entity because of Napoleon Bonaparte, and he hauls off the archives back to Paris. So there's the first hint, that he has some sort of esoteric interest that goes beyond what we've been talking about in the history books.
But he's also looking for a document, some particular document or series of documents, because he demands 500 manuscripts that are actually from the Vatican Library that are being held in Venice. He demands those, and they drag their feet. And when they finally deliver on it, they're I believe, 200 shy. And he insists, he said, I require the 500. I want the full 5. So he was looking for something. And I think that the something he might have been looking for could have involved further corroboration of the secret. I think what is the secret of his genealogical heredity. I'm stumbling. This is the first time, folks, that I've talked about this research in this book publicly, so bear with me. I apologize if I'm...
Well, there's just so much. I mean, it's understandable. There's just so much in the book, and there's so much dot connecting that you're doing. And I came away from reading the book, Walter, with the suspicion that in addition to searching for these documents, and that he's trying to figure something out about his own genealogy, that genealogy and his unique status is also tied to his esoteric interests. So I want you to get into why you think that he was a specially bred child, and that he had all of this, all these people surrounding him that had these esoteric, philosopher, scientist interests.
Well, this connects to kind of the more wild end of the themes and the topics. But what we're talking about here is, from my perspective, in this book, is essentially the game was this: he who has the earliest claim wins within the rules of their own dynastic world.
Right.
Okay. So here you have, in my opinion, the House of Este and all the little dynasties they control, which extend into England, as we know. Mm-hmm. And I essentially, in my research and analysis, I pretty much summed it up as the Este. Let me get this right. The Este house is with the Prussian, Junker, Hun, Scythian line.
Right.
Now, what this does is it takes the House of Este and reverse traces it back to the murkiest parts of history. Okay, the Scythians came from that dark area of the steppes in the east, which the further you go back, the less we really know. It's a true dark age that they emerge from, and they eventually, show up as the Huns, and we know who the Huns were, Attila, in the post-Roman world, and then of course we have, what's interesting is this Junker Prussian movement, this Germanic movement here, and through their duplicitous Machiavellian way they do things, they had gained full control since about the middle of the 10th century of Europe, all the dynastic houses of Europe. The problem is that prior to, I think it was 951 AD that the House of Este was established, the problem is in the 5th century, there was this dynasty called the Merovingian dynasty. And this is where we have, a lot of the Franks and the Iberians, and once you start getting into that, you're getting into another murky area of human civilization, which that in the scholarship of today, the Merovingian leads back to Egypt, according to some scholars. And I get into that in the book. I think that's, for obvious reasons, legitimate there. But when you get into then the Egypt angle, and you go farther back into that dark, murky time when the Scythians were emerging from the east, you had the Iberians and the Mauritanians before that, and folks. Basically, you're going back to that era of civilization that we have come to call Atlantis.
Okay. Now, since you mentioned Egypt and Merovingians, there is a huge clue just squatting right in the middle of the Egyptian expedition that Napoleon mounts, that to my mind indicates that you're really on to something, and it's a certain family name of an individual that goes with Bonaparte to Egypt. Can you tell us about that? The family name that begins with H?
We are talking about the Colonel de Hautpoul.
Hautpoul.
Yes, the Hautpouls are. That one knocked my socks off when I was doing the early research. I started research when I was with Joseph a year ago. I visited him, and we went to his favorite bookstore. And I was actually looking for material to follow up on the Juan Cabrillo. I just happened to find this volume of a book I'd heard of, but it's kind of hard to find. It's Bonaparte in Egypt by J. Christopher Harold. I go, oh, delightful. And I bought that. And after I got home from the trip, I finished the one book, and I jumped into this, and it was in that book that I discovered, what, there's a de Hautpoul. It couldn't be. So,
and it is.
Google it. I'm like, oh my God, they're in this. And so,
well,
I was off to
what's the significance of the Hautpoul family?
The Hautpoul family are smack dab in the middle of the mystery of Rennes-le-Château.
Yep.
And the whole Berenger, Saunière, Nicolas Poussin, Et in Arcadia Ego. And boy, oh boy, do I have something to say about that painting. Since you read the book, I've tweaked the chapter 12, and I'll tell you what that is, because if it wasn't clear to you what I was saying, Joseph, when you read it, it's very clear now. But there we have Colonel de Hautpoul was a nephew. He was only just a couple of degrees away from Madame de Hautpoul,
right,
whose gravestone is a major part of that whole Nicolas Poussin, Rennes-le-Château, the painting in Arcadia Ego. Madame de Hautpoul is the the connecting thing there. Or I'm sorry, Colonel de Hautpoul is the connecting thing between Napoleon and the Rennes-le-Chateau milieu.
Wasn't he the one that actually found the Rosetta Stone?
Well, here's what's interesting. He was with Bouchard, Captain Bouchard, whose name pops up as an interesting piece of evidence to my hypothesis later on. But he and Captain Bouchard, who interestingly Bouchard is credited, but they say that Hautpoul was with him. Yes, they stumbled upon the Rosetta Stone together.
Yeah.
And interesting that the Rosetta Stone, of course, as we know, is a stone that unlocks, the languages. It's a key to something. And in the middle of the Rennes-le-Chateau mystery is this gravestone of Madame de Hautpoul that unlocks the mystery. And there's this synchronous resonance in what's going on here. And I think that, well, what it led me to was my analysis that people have the Rennes-le-Chateau mystery all wrong. I don't think it has anything to do with Christ.
Right. I would agree with that. Yeah, I would agree with that.
I think the mystery's about Napoleon.
Yeah.
There's a tidbit for you.
Yeah.
From the book. I'm convinced. I think the painting, the Poussin painting, the landscape depicted is a landscape in the Louisiana Territory.
Yeah.
It is not anywhere in Europe. And I think that what Bérenger Saunière discovered was Napoleon Bonaparte's true bloodline and how he had a legitimate claim to the throne that he took, and really to all the thrones he was taking.
Well, yeah, and he's the simple nutshell is with all these characters from the Languedoc associated with Bonaparte and with the expedition to Egypt, you've got something going, all the way back to the Albigensian Crusade. And it's just, it boggles the mind.
Is the Comte de Marbouf. I wasn't able to find any kind of connection that would have raised a flag other than Rennes means the Queen's City.
Right.
The Comte de Marbouf is from Rennes, France. Not Rennes-le-Chateau, but Rennes, France. And there's reason to suspect that he was, what we know as Hidalgo de Sangre, which is knight by blood, which means a blood descendant of an original Templar knight. And so it's little tidbits. So there, from childhood, he had a father who, by virtue of an interesting character named Francesco Il More Bonaparte of the late 15th century, between that guy and his background and the Comte de Marbouf, Napoleon was surrounded by the Knights Templar and their ilk his entire life. But going back to this issue with Colonel de Hautpoul, I do not think it was an accident that that man was one of his officers that was in Egypt with him.
Right.
I don't think there were others. Desai. I think he was likely a Templar Knight intelligence agent. He's an interesting character. He's the one that made sure. I mean, they're in the middle of trying to pursue a Mameluke commander or whatever, but yet Desai makes sure that Denon has an entire day at Dendera. Now, Dendera, folks, is where these reliefs are that are supposed to be the electric light bulb and the jet pill. It's supposed to be, advanced technology.
Yep.
Desai, one of Napoleon's officers, makes sure that Denon, one of the scientists, they call them savants, who went to Egypt, and we'll be getting into that, he made sure that he saw that and had time to draw these things and see all this stuff, and in particular archaeological sites. So de Hautpoul's involved with finding the Rosetta Stone. Desai's involved with making sure the scientist sees these important things. Basically, it sums up to there was something real interesting going on here. Some people knew things, and they were.
So in other
they were.
words, you've got a case that Bonaparte and his birth are being sort of manipulated. He grows up
Yes.
around all of these philosopher scientists,
Yes.
and that's in his early life. And then all of a sudden, oh, hey, I'm going to go to Egypt and take a French army and a French fleet there, and it's stuffed to the gills with all of these philosopher scientists. So in other words, this is not accidental.
Right. Oh, and let's remember, they go by way of Malta.
Malta.
That we know today has some of the oldest archaeological
Right.
megalithic structures on Earth. Now, in those days, the hypogeum is there. In those days, we're told that the hypogeum was not discovered. I disagree with that. I think the Knights of Malta who were there knew darn well that hypogeum was there, and I think Napoleon knew it was there, and it was a big reason why he went to Malta.
And Knights of Malta, gee, there's nothing suspicious about that connection either. You know?
Right.
So
right. And before he heads to Egypt, he recruits is it 34 or 37 of them? It's 34 Knights of Malta,
right,
to go with him to Egypt. And they gladly, hey,
sure, let's go.
You know, actually, when he took Malta, they just kind of put up a half-hearted fight, and they practically cheered him and his army when they, said, okay, we've captured this place. For the most part, they liked him.
All right.
And that's the story you find with Napoleon that you never hear in history. People loved the guy. I mean, just they even places he conquered, they loved him. There was just something special about the guy.
Okay, so here's a curveball for you, Walter. Yeah. Since we're speculating, and you've got all of these, you've got this bloodline connection. You've got the family being in the Venetian Golden Book of ancient nobility. You've got all of these philosopher scientists surrounding him in his early life, and then on this expedition to Egypt. So here's the curveball. Do you think it's possible that they manipulated Napoleon into existence, so to speak, not only to challenge other bloodlines with a more ancient claim, which is a very important thing that you've pointed out, but do you think they might have done so because they were trying to get some sort of biometric activation of some ancient stuff?
Yep. The answer to that is yes. That's no curveball, because as you know, in the book, a couple of times I use your phrase. Here's what happened, folks. By the time Napoleon went to Egypt for particular reasons, and one of those was that when he came home, he had their physics.
Yeah.
And that was what really scared the hell out of him.
Okay,
and that
so
speaks to what you're saying.
Let's go there. What is their physics that you think that he had access to or understood part of?
While in Egypt, I'm convinced that he mastered intentionality. He mastered intentionality applied to particularly arranged levels of consciousness. I had a hard time writing that.
Yeah, I know you did.
Make sure it's clear, but to verbalize it's even more difficult. But that's essentially, if I may refer to your metaphor, he understood your metaphor.
Okay.
Is what we're talking about here. And he understood where the individual, in this case himself, fits in, and applies this knowledge to impose one's intentionality.
Does he does he get onto this through his meditation practices and so on before he goes to Egypt?
I think he is heading in that direction because before he goes to Egypt, there's a particular man in his life who becomes a close mentor, and that is Gaspard Manger.
Manger.
And I believe that Gaspard Manger is essential in what happened at the pyramid.
Why? Let's go there.
Gaspard Manger was one of the philosopher scientists we're talking about. He also was the father of, what is it, descriptive geometry?
Yes.
And his work, his discoveries, his theories, or whatever, these get into tetrahedral physics.
Right.
And I know your audience has heard of that, but usually not in association with
Napoleon.
18th century, trips to Egypt. Very specifically, I get into in the book my interpretation of the what's called the Mange point. And the way I saw it was Napoleon tapped into the Mange point in the pyramid.
Okay.
Before he went down there, because of Manger, because of all these interests he had, before he went down there, I think it was a suspicion of that something he had learned or just touched on in his meditations could be enhanced or would be enhanced, or he was in pursuit definitely of something along those lines before he went.
Right.
So I think I think he knew what he was looking for. I think he guessed what he was going to find. I think what was unexpected for him was that he would experience it on steroids.
All right. Now you mentioned that he was looking for something and he had an expectation of what he was going to find. We all know the public narrative of the expedition to Egypt. Maurice de Talleyrand and the Directory decide, well, we've got to do something about this upstart general and get him out of our hair. Let's send him to Egypt.
Right.
But you're saying, no, this was much more well thought out and that he was looking for something. What was he looking for?
Well, it dates back to, I think, of course, the seeds are planted in childhood, but his serious interest in going to Egypt predates, Talleyrand's involvement here. And I think that's because of let me say this in the plural, the Mangers. What I didn't know initially was Gaspard's brother, Louis, was Napoleon's artillery instructor at the École Militaire. And there is a positive progress review on Napoleon done by Louis Manger, which I believe was part of a vetting process that resulted in Louis's brother Gaspard coming forward to be Napoleon's mentor. And I think that the evidence shows that it's likely that Gaspard Manger had been already talking up the idea of Napoleon going to Egypt. But I think
makes sense.
I think the main seed that really just ignited the whole thing was the curious, and this is interesting because there's two instances of this, of something being found and discussed, but the specifics are not
there.
And that is the 1100-year-old. We're talking in 1797. It was 1100 years old then. Papyrus that Manger and Berthollet, I believe.
Yep.
I think it's Berthollet, bring to Napoleon while they're in Italy. Oh, look at this thing that was seized as part of your conquest. Well, hey, how do we know? And it just dawned on me. I didn't mention this in the book, but how do we know that was even something that Napoleon seized?
Right.
This papyrus could have been something in the possession of these philosopher scientists, specifically Moget, and it was presented to Napoleon at the right time. Now, it's a papyrus, an Egyptian papyrus, and by this time, Napoleon had already, I think, presented or analyzed various reports about going to Egypt. So there we have all the clues that the idea of going to Egypt was something that was in his mind for
Right.
quite a while. Now, he used, in my opinion, he used the desire of the Directory and Talleyrand and all the other people to get him out of the way. He used that to get the logistics and supply and the support he needed to make his expedition happen.
Right.
In other words, yeah, okay, you guys want to get rid of me? Oh, colony, okay, yeah, I'll bite. Yeah, I'll just give me the army, give me this everything I want. And they were willing to give it to him because they didn't know what he had up his sleeve.
Right.
You know, in my opinion, they had no idea what he was really going. But they, ironically, they made it happen for him.
And since you mentioned papyrus, let's go back, folks, and remember that there is every indication that the Templars, once they get started, had some document in their possession that was from that era that led them over to the Holy Land. And this involved Venice as well. So yeah, I think what you're saying, Walter, is that there's a deep esoteric history to Napoleon Bonaparte that all these dots start connecting and they end up with him.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, folks, by the time, and I know we've just got started talking about this, but let me tell you up front, I'll say it again later. You'll probably hear me say it a million times in the coming year. Winston Churchill called Napoleon Bonaparte the greatest man of action born in Europe since Julius Caesar.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, when you're talking the 19th century, and yes, his life started in the 18th century, but when you're talking the 19th century, there's really two great human beings that come to mind, and that's Napoleon Bonaparte and Abraham Lincoln, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I know there's some folks out there that would want to question Lincoln being on there, and there's many that would question Napoleon, being on there. But it's really, the more you get to know this man and look at the actual facts and stuff that you're usually not taught in school,
Right.
not only do these odd esoteric things just jump right out, but it's pretty clear this guy was a brilliant mind. He really was genius level, and he had in particular a mathematical aptitude,
Mm-hmm.
which is essential in understanding these things we're talking about that that I think he did in Egypt, specifically inside that Great Pyramid.
Right. So let's talk about Napoleon and the Great Pyramid for a moment.
Yes.
What's so odd there? You mentioned the Mange Point,
yes,
and which is the center inside of a tetrahedron from the faces of a tetrahedron. And you speculate that you could have a similar type of Mange Point in a pyramidal structure, which is not a tetrahedral structure. And you mentioned the episode where Napoleon allegedly goes into the Great Pyramid. Mm-hmm. So let's go there.
I had been familiar, like I think a lot of people have been familiar with, this legend that Napoleon Bonaparte spent a night in the King's Chamber, the Great Pyramid, and he came out visibly shaken and would not talk about what happened, and allegedly made a comment, you wouldn't believe it anyway. And then, he goes on to become Napoleon Bonaparte and all that. And we're just left with this weird story. What's interesting is I was never able to find in any of the biographical sources or any, thing that people would call legitimate that corroborated that it even happened. However, the historical circumstances and the things we do know pretty much determine that this likely happened, that he did spend this night. It comes down to Harold, J. Christopher Harold, is the one biographer I read who claims that Napoleon never went inside the Great Pyramid. And yet, between Walter Scott and the recent biographers, Andrew Roberts, Alan
Mm-hmm.
Shawm, and them, it's clear that he did. I mean, they state, some of them even state, well, yeah, he went in there. So, you know, I think with Harold, that's a product of that spin and propaganda that we're talking about. You know, you have to ask yourself, did somebody at one point not want anyone to know that
Right.
Napoleon went inside this pyramid, and why? Well, if it was something extraordinary like this. But going back to that legend, I thought, okay, wow, this is pretty interesting. What the heck happened to the guy? And then as I'm doing research, I find this quote where he's talking about when he meditates, how he sees things and things come to him. And I thought, well, here you have a guy that really seriously meditates, and he's an advocate of this. It really works for him. And here we have the story that he had spent a night in the king's chamber. And of course, people, you know, you get all the stuff that comes with that suggestion. Yeah, I'm thinking, well, what the heck happened? Did he combine these meditation methods with being inside the Great Pyramid?
Right.
And then if he did, what could possibly happen? Well, in our times, you have the work of Christopher Dunn, who talks about the pyramid being a machine. You have Joseph's work and the Giza Death Star, the pyramid being, you know, a kind of machine. And you have, of course, the pyramid studies with human consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, the question becomes obvious. Did Napoleon tap into the machine nature of this structure, or some residual energy that remains in it? And did he somehow open up or tap his consciousness into, as the legend says, that he possibly tapped into what's called the Akashic record?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, so that just kind of opened it up to, okay, now let's consider if it's possible that something like this happened. So then when I looked into that, we get into the is it Tiller?
Mm-hmm.
Tillerman or it's
Tiller.
Tiller, right?
Yep.
Yeah, Tiller. And particularly the material you go into in Microcosm and Medium, it kind of reveals itself when you insert Gaspard Monge in there.
Yes. Well, it stands to reason, Walter, to my mind, that with his strong esoteric interest, he's got all of these scientists there. He's got his own kind of meditative, metaphysical or spiritual practice, whatever you wish to call it, that it stands to reason that that kind of person with that kind of intense curiosity about ancient things would have gone into the pyramid. You know, I can't see Bonaparte being there and not wanting to do this.
And that's exactly what, as you know, what I say in the book is
right.
Everything about this man, there's no way he did. I mean, Harold says that he didn't go in there because he found out he was going to have to crawl through that one shaft. And I'm just laughing out loud. I'm like, this isn't the fat glum Napoleon. You know, when he goes to Egypt, he's ladies, if you're watching or listening to this, the Napoleon that went to Egypt was what you would call a dreamboat. Okay. It was,
he was still a very young man. And the other thing about
dark eyes and
the other thing about this Akashic record thing that makes sense to me is I've always thought that there's some consciousness aspect to the pyramid, however you want to view it, you know, machine, power plant, weapon, whatever. Yeah. But the other thing that makes sense to me is, as I've tried to point out in the pyramid books, the Great Pyramid is a local coupled harmonic oscillator to local celestial space-time. So in other words, it is a structure that embodies to a certain extent those what you're calling Akashic records. Mm-hmm. So with his meditative practice and so on and so forth, you know, Lord knows what happened to the guy inside that thing, and he comes out, you know, just kind of freaked out.
He discovered that he became that coupling medium to that field of information that Tiller talks about.
Right. And I think you make a good case for that in that part of the book. So basically, the expedition to Egypt was to find out things, which they certainly did. It was not, as far as Napoleon was concerned, it was not, just to go found a colony in Egypt and so on and so forth and cut the supply lines for the British Empire to India. It was much more. And we get a clue of that by the way that Napoleon reacts, don't we, to the fact that de Talleyrand reneges on his deal to send him reinforcements, and Napoleon has to beat a retreat back to France. So let's talk about that a bit.
Yes, Talleyrand, wonderful guy that he was, had promised Napoleon that he personally would go to Constantinople and work out all the things that Napoleon would need while in Egypt, to get cooperation with the local chieftains and imams and such. And he's realizing pretty quickly when he's out in the field and he's facing just constant belligerence and attacks from the locals. He realized pretty quickly that something's going on with what Talleyrand promised. And he finds out that Talleyrand never even went to Constantinople. And not only did he not do that, but he sent his emissaries to have all the people that were supposed to cooperate with Napoleon. He sent his emissaries to get them to fight Napoleon every step of the way. So essentially, Talleyrand, in my opinion, was part of an effort to really hopefully kill Napoleon in battle or capture him or some such thing. And Napoleon realized, okay, when Napoleon decided to go back to France, this is painted as, oh, Egypt was such a failure and he was so ashamed. He just, wanted to get out of there and he ran like a coward. And when you look at the details, that's not it at all. This business with Talleyrand, what Talleyrand had done to him, contributed to him realizing, okay, yeah, they're really hoping that I don't return from here. They're really hoping that this destroys me. And what's going on back in Europe, in France and Europe, and of course he's learning that the oligarchical nations, their armies, his opposition, they're all fighting to regain territory that he had taken. In his absence, they're doing this. So for a variety of reasons, he realizes that, okay, he's got to get back to France. Not the least of which among these reasons are somebody's putting together a coup for him to take over France. And I think in that by that summer of 1799, by that very strange experience he had in the pyramid, he had what he came for. The real reason he went to Egypt, he got it, and it was time to go back to apply what he learned. And this, folks, is the intentionality that I'm talking about. Whatever happened to him with the pyramid, this is when he had their physics. He figured out how to do it, how to apply his intentionality, and he was off to the races when he returned to France.
Now, there's one more thing that you mentioned, and it's well known, a well-known facet of his expedition to Egypt. But to me, given your esoteric spin on his entire life, your interpretation of all of these people around him that are influencing him in that direction, there's one final thing that to me cinches the case that expedition had a covert secret mission, and that was his attempt to march through Palestine and lay siege to the old Templar fortress at Acre, because there's really no military reason for him to have tried to do this. And given the supply situation that he would have faced, it would have been a nightmare. And of course, he was unsuccessful. But I think that kind of cinches the case that there's some esoteric agenda that's going on with this whole Egyptian expedition thing, with that attempt that he made to seize Acre. Because I think, again, like you, he was probably looking for something. So, doff my hat again that you've you've connected all these dots to that expedition, and also uh, giving the real reasons for why he wants to go back to France. Um, at that point, uh, the way you've laid it out, at that point, he's learned what he needs to know. And the oligarchs of Europe, the interconnectedness of all of those royal houses are against him and against France at that point. So let's go back to France and get into what I think is what I is really the pièce de résistance in the whole book. Doff my hat again for pointing this one out. Let's talk about um, Napoleon and his body double.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
It's to kind of put the cap on the Egyptian thing. You know, he's returned to France and he's done it intentionally and in a way that's intentional because basically, to put it another way, he had their physics, but he understands something about his personal destiny. That's what was really driving his return to France, I believe. So he understands this about his personal destiny. He comes back and he starts. He kind of has to do business in a different way because there very shortly are increasingly threats on his life.
Right.
Now there were attempts at assassination while he was in Egypt.
Right.
Okay, but I think at the time they were looking at that, or he was looking at it, historians look at it as that was just the locals, you know, because he was down there pissing them off and it was locals. But when you look at it from the perspective I was looking at it,
Yep.
I see it as possible assassins. And this started while he was in Egypt. I think there's monkey business with the plague in Jaffa, which notoriously is considered a black mark on his record. And when I say monkey business, I think maybe it was an infestation that was helped along, possibly by Sidney Smith's Royal Navy. But so there you had him. He was already, by the end of the Egyptian campaign, he was used to dodging bullets. Okay, so now he's back in France. The coup happens. He becomes first consul. And the attempts on his life continue. So the historians never really talk about the specific measures that he went to protect himself. They never really get into too much detail on what Fouché, kind of another wonderful guy.
Oh, isn't he though?
Yeah, was doing, you know, to protect Napoleon, if he was doing anything. It's not until later in the story that you have two very strong reasons to wonder how soon Napoleon got onto the idea of using a double to protect him. Actually, pardon me, there's three instances that later come up that give you kind of retrospective suspicion of this. The first one is when, and again, I apologize if my French pronunciations are just off, but there's an issue where I think there was a building issue with the Prussian army, and he wanted them to think he was in Compiègne.
Compiègne.
Yeah.
Compiègne.
Compiègne, on a hunting trip.
Uh-huh.
So he orders them to send his horses, his carriage, and his hunting retinue off to Compiègne, but it neglects to say if there's somebody playing him. And I thought, well, that's you know, you would think that he would address, okay, they're going to see the horses, they're going to see the carriage, but where are they going to see the guy with the bicorn hat, you know, and the green coat? He doesn't say anything about that. So then you get to something that you had pointed out to me, and that is the incident shortly before Grenoble. This is in, I think it's called Lafferty, which is kind of an interesting, almost English word for a French town or Belgian town, whatever, a southern French town. It is after Napoleon escapes Elba. Now, folks, the first time he was exiled was to the island of Elba, and he escaped and returned. And this is shortly before his end as emperor, of course, because he only lasts, the 100 days after that. But after he escapes from Elba, he has his unit that was with him, that he managed to put together, and they come up from Caen, from the coast, and they're going on foot. Napoleon's on foot, and at this area, at these grassy plains in this area called Lafferty, he's confronted by the 5th Regiment, his first regiment that he had,
and Marshal Ney.
Marshal Ney is there leading them, kind of nervously. And what's interesting is what the historians say that he said was, and they're not. I don't think they're accurate on this, because one says one, the other says another thing. But he says something to the effect of soldiers, do you want to kill me, is one thing. And another one, I am your commander. I am your general or whatever. And of course, they all end up cheering, and they love the fact that they see him again, and everything's hunky-dory. But there's that moment where he's standing there and they all got their guns aimed at him. He finds out that most of the guns weren't loaded, that these guys had no intention of shooting him, because, again, they loved the man, okay? They loved him. But it was a tense moment where he didn't know if Marshal Ney, was ordered to kill him right there or not. He didn't know whether these men were going to do this or not, so kill him or not. So there's an interesting little bit that I don't know where they got it from, but in 1970 there was a film produced by Dino De Laurentiis titled Waterloo.
Yes.
And in this film, in that scene, where he confronts the 5th Regiment, what he says is, he asks them a question: men of the 5th, do you know who I am?
Yes.
Now, I think I think the writer of that understood the spirit of what's in the historical accounts.
Right.
Or maybe somewhere there was a witness account where that's what he said was, do you know who I am? The point is, I think the film captured the essence of what happened there. Now, of course, Napoleon Bonaparte was the most recognized guy in, the known world at that time. Okay. And the men of his regiment, his army, of course, when they see Napoleon Bonaparte, they're going to know exactly who he is. So why would he ask anything about, hey, it's me, right? You guys recognize me. Do you know who I am? Well, I argue that this was an instance wherein his brother Joseph doubled for him to make sure to make sure that he still had the army on his side.
Right.
Now, why do we say this? well, because when you look, and you can look at the paintings, but it was known in his lifetime that he and his brother Joseph looked remarkably alike. Very much alike. And the other siblings didn't look so much alike, didn't look that much like them at all. But those two looked so much alike. Okay. So we have him send my hunting party to Compiègne. So the Prussians think I'm there. Well, I argue that he probably used somebody to double for him there. But I think in the particular case at his return from Elba in front of the 5th, I think Joseph stood in for him to, make sure what their reaction would be.
And there's another possibility that you didn't mention in the book, but once you got me started thinking in terms of Joseph doubling for him on occasion, that was the famous instance, where Napoleon has the Grand Army on the coasts of the English Channel drilling to invade England. And then he does a complete about face and marches it all the way over, and whacks the Austrians at the Battle of Austerlitz.
Yeah.
And there's a classic case for use of a body double. Have one Napoleon, on the coast with a few units, and the other one, marching over to defeat Marshal Mack. But this body double thing gets really interesting.
At the end.
And I'm not I'm not going to spoil it. I just want to say, let's go there. Let's find out about your body double hypothesis after Waterloo.
Okay. Yeah. There was oh gosh, I'm doing a brain up. There was something I wanted to add on to that, but
you'll think of it.
The fact that you mentioned when he was drilling for the English to see an invasion, which he never intended to do.
Right.
But he said more than once that sometimes it's smart to make an enemy think you're going to invade them. And he said that in specifically connected with England. I do not believe that Napoleon Bonaparte ever intended to invade England, but he had them in such a dither over it that it worked. And I think that was an instance. And you're right. That's a good opportunity. So, yes, after Waterloo.
Here we go, folks.
Here's what's really interesting. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was Waterloo, but one of the battles, to show you this man's sense of humor. After it might have been Moscow. I'm not sure. It was one of his few defeats, and we should kind of comment on that later too. How many battles this man won, and how few that he lost. But after being defeated, it might have been Waterloo, but it might have been Moscow or something. As he's riding away, getting the hell out of Dodge, because here comes the opposing army. He turns to his second in command and he basically says, well, we really screwed that one up, didn't we? We did a great thing there. And, the guy couldn't believe that Bonaparte, Napoleon's making a joke about this. But this is the kind of, he did have a self-deprecating sense of humor. But after Waterloo, he returns to Malmaison, and he goes into the library. And he just calmly starts reading a book and making notes and sketching out plans. But he's reading Humboldt's book about the Americas.
Right.
Alexander von Humboldt's book about the Americas. And, here it's after Waterloo. Here the Prussians are on their way, marching, in the direction of Paris. The British, of course, would like to string him up. And, he's just calmly reading this book about America, and he starts planning and plotting. He orders all sorts of expensive scientific equipment. This stuff is purchased. Telescopes, survey equipment, you name it. Everything you would need on a massive expedition. Okay. He orders up the horses and all the logistics and supply. He starts doing that, and he informs his close circle that what they're going to do is go to America and and explore from North America on down to Tierra del Fuego, the whole thing. And he's planning this as the end is coming. They've already drafted up his second abdication paper. Talleyrand has already graciously offered himself as the new French leader, which they reject, by the way, because they know what an ass he is. And, but here it's all coming down, and he's already planning his next move. It's really interesting. So what happens is when he's told, hey, the Prussians are on their way, they're almost to Paris, we gotta get out of here. They board, I believe at that time they board the LaSalle, and they go to La Rochefort. Is that how you pronounce it? Rochefort?
La Rochelle, I think you mean.
No, it's Rochefort.
Is it Rochefort?
Yeah, it's Rochefort. So they go to Rochefort, and while they're there, he continues all this planning, and he's told that the LaSalle and the Medusa
are two frigates.
Yeah.
Two French frigates.
Yeah,
Okay.
2 French frigates are ready to take him across the Atlantic to America. But what happens is the HMS Bellerophon shows up.
Mm-hmm.
I think it has 74 guns on it.
And it's a
And
74 second-rate ship of the line.
yeah, they're ready to just, stop or sink whatever French ship is going to try to get out of there. And now this lead up's important, folks, for going back to the double thing. Okay, so here you have Napoleon planning to just say, "Screw it, I'm getting out of here. I'm done with this politics stuff. I'm gonna go to America and I'm gonna explore." Okay, he's planning this. Then you have 2 ships that are ready to take him. Okay, when the Bellerophon shows up, you get one of those ships where we're told the captain wimps out in some sources, but in other sources we're told no, he's willing to take on the Bellerophon as a diversion so
Right.
Napoleon can get away on the other boat.
Right.
And then in addition to that, 2 French officers of their navy have agreed to take a smaller craft and get Napoleon to an American merchant vessel of the United States. It's waiting 8 miles off the coast to take Napoleon Bonaparte to the United States.
And how did they just happen to be there to do that? You know,
Exactly. They just happened to be there. So we're getting to the crunch time where England, that ship is not going to leave without Napoleon Bonaparte.
right?
The bottom line is, so we know for a fact. Here it comes. We know for a fact at the decision point, there's no way the La Salle and Medusa could get out of there without getting obliterated, hunted down and obliterated. Napoleon Bonaparte was going to have to be turned over to the British, to the Bellerophon.
Right.
At this point, this is history. The witnesses, say this.
At
this point, Joseph Bonaparte has shown up, okay? And he offers to Napoleon, let's switch places. I will take your place and will turn me over to the British as you get on the boat and you get to the United States. You get to America, okay? We're told that the man with all this stuff that we've been talking about, and when you read the book, we're told that this man who has also been planning all the finer details of getting to the United States and what he's going to do there, we're told that at the last minute he decides, no, I'm just going to hand myself over to the honor and mercy of the British. And that he gives himself up and he's piped aboard the Bellerophon. And of course, at that time, it's believed that Napoleon, he believes that, he's going to spend the rest of his days on a nice estate in England and he'll receive visitors and he'll still be treated as the former emperor, blah, blah, blah. They don't pull the St. Helena dirty deal until the last minute
right.
after this switch. Now, what I think happened was, folks, is that Napoleon took Joseph's offer. I think they switched places. I think it was not Napoleon Bonaparte who was turned over to the Bellerophon. I do not think it was Napoleon Bonaparte who was taken to England and then to St. Helena. The exile who spent the rest of his days on St. Helena was Joseph Bonaparte, and Napoleon Bonaparte came to the United States.
And lived as Joseph.
We are told he returned and died in Italy in 1844. But what I think happened was Napoleon Bonaparte switched places. And
well, after I read that, I thought, you've nailed it, because as you point out, there's some interesting things about quote unquote Joseph Bonaparte in the United States that seem to confirm your thesis. So could you mention a couple of those?
Yeah, Joseph Bonaparte. Here's the thing: Napoleon, for all his, and that's a whole lengthy conversation. But in a nutshell, Napoleon, despite the coup, despite making himself emperor, he really was not in love with the trappings of opulence and regality. When you look at it closely, his move to make himself emperor had a very legitimate reason.
Right.
And one of the points that you want me to point out is that during this coronation, okay, when he made himself emperor, and I do mean made himself emperor, he and Josephine and their retinue entered Notre Dame through the wrong door.
Door, yes.
And he and Josephine start cracking up. They're just laughing like, "Oh my God, we're a couple of boobs here. We don't even know what door to come in." Ha ha ha. Now, if a guy who was a megalomaniac that was all dour and serious about himself, that just would have been horrific to him. That just would have been a major faux pas and embarrassing. But Napoleon, all witnesses said he just cracked up and they went around to the right door. Now, the important thing about his coronation, okay, what he did and how he did it says everything about, or it says a lot about, there were reasons why he did this. But
right.
Going back to when the Pope pulled the fast one on Charlemagne, and as he set the crown down, the Holy Roman Emperor, Napoleon takes the crown out of the Pope's hands and puts it on his own head. Now, what is this saying? This is a reflection of the Enlightenment principles, people. What Napoleon did there was he said, I don't need your church authority. I don't need another dynastic house authority. By my own authority and as a representative of the people, okay, of, and Enlightenment principles, I, as the people, self-government, people. That's what he was saying. Self-governance. I put the crown on my own head. It was a way of expressing what he felt, we had done here with our revolution in the United States by, founding self-government. That was a kind of a symbolic what he was trying to do there.
Plus, he also had that ancient bloodline claim.
That's the other thing, because he chose the Merovingian bee as his personal symbol. That speaks to he knew who and what he was by a certain point. Now, here's the thing. I tell you that mainly to emphasize the business about walking in the door and really being self-deprecating. Joseph was not that way. Joseph Bonaparte loved being on the throne of Spain. He loved all the trappings. Joseph Bonaparte, I forget what, I think Alan Shawm, one of the biographers of Napoleon, says Joseph was the social butterfly of the family. He was the one who dug all this stuff. Okay. So here you have, so-called Joseph Bonaparte spending the rest of his days in the United States, acting like Napoleon. And you have Napoleon on St. Helena acting like Joseph.
Right.
I demand to be, called, emperor. And wait a minute, what do you mean I'm not going to be given an estate in England, that's worthy of my station, and
right.
On and so forth. And it's just really, when you're reading about this guy, and then you read about his behavior and demeanor on St. Helena, you realize, wait a minute, there's a disconnect there. And when you read the same thing about Joseph, when you're reading about Joseph, okay, who's very pissy about being treated regal and proper, according to his station, and yet he doesn't act like that when he's in the United States, you're going, again, there's a disconnect here. And that disconnect is that moment in La Rochefort when
they switch.
Joseph offers to double, because you'd say, well, why would Joseph do that if he's going to be exiled? Remember, at the point Joseph did that, nobody knew about St. Helena. Everybody thought, and I believe it's more than implied, I think the British intended to put him on an estate somewhere. But here's what happened. When the boat got to England, the Bellerophon got to England, or the boat that took him got to England, what happened was there were a bunch of British citizens all gathered around wanting to see Napoleon. There were pro-Napoleon people in England.
Right.
And they were fascinated. And suddenly the oligarchs in London were scared. They're like, oh my God, if this guy comes here, he's going to be more popular than our king and we are and all that stuff. We can't have him here.
Right.
That's when they dreamed up the idea of St. Helena. And at that point, Joseph would have been, oh, shoot, wait a minute. But, he loved his brother. He wanted to protect his brother.
Right.
And, he was a man of his word. He gave his word that he would carry out this charade. And he probably still thought, as they were sailing, the thousands of miles down to St. Helena, which is several hundred miles off the coast of Africa, he probably still thought, well, I'm still going to be treated really well. It's going to be hunky dory. Now, there's another thing. Napoleon was notoriously somebody who did not enjoy sea travel. Okay,
Right.
He hated it. He admitted it. When just crossing the Mediterranean from Malta to Egypt, he was miserably seasick and just, oh God, it was awful. He hated it. Joseph is, he had some days where he was seasick, but everybody goes through that on a long sea journey. But he was out on the deck celebrating his birthday and being the bon vivant, and there's no way Napoleon would not have done that. And that was not just on the way to England from Rochefort. That was after he learned his fate about St. Helena and was sailing from England all the way down to off the west coast of Africa. He was still being the socialite and the bon vivant on the deck. And again, that's Joseph. That's not Napoleon, but we're told that's how Napoleon was behaving on the way to St. Helena. So there's all sorts of clues, I think, that support the idea that Napoleon and Joseph did indeed switch identities at Rochefort. And
which means that the Bonaparte family in the United States are descended from Napoleon, not Joseph.
Well, here's the thing. Charles Bonaparte, who became Secretary of the Navy,
right,
for
Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah. He was the grandson of Jeremy, Napoleon's youngest brother.
Oh, okay.
Here's the thing we have to ask ourselves. Who might Joseph / Napoleon, I'm going to say Napoleon. Who might Napoleon have had children with while he was here in the United States as Joseph? That's the question we got to ask. The question is, how many actual descendants of Napoleon Bonaparte are running around in the United States? And I'm going to use this point to announce something. You and I had discussed it briefly, and I just decided that it just has to be done. There's so much material that question of Napoleon descendants and all sorts of other things are going to be fleshed out and explored, folks. This book I'm releasing is merely volume 1.
Oh, good. Excellent.
I still have so much to present in this story that there's going to have to be volume 2.
Well, that the Bonaparte family, if your switch hypothesis is true, and I think it's a very good, strong prima facie case that that's what happened, that you argue in the book. We know that if that's the case, the Bonaparte family probably knows about it, have kept their lips tightly sealed, because again, if your thesis is correct, and I think it is, that there was a big oligarchical struggle against Napoleon precisely because of his bloodline, that's going to be of concern to this very same people today as it was back then. So
of course, and make no mistake, yes. I suspected early on, I wondered, my God, what is the presence, the involvement, what is the role of these Bonapartists today?
Yeah.
And I started saying, my gosh, I began to see things through the rest of the 19th century that within this context started making a lot of sense. That's what the second volume will do. It will get a little bit more on Napoleon, but it will greatly go into.
Well, you know the story of my little Bonapartist French grandmother.
Yes. See, people don't realize how Napoleon. There's the other thing about this. When you get into this Napoleon in America stuff, he was really loved here.
Yeah.
He was seen as, when there was a rumor after Waterloo and the abdication that they had beheaded him, there were American newspapers that, said infamy and shame and sin on those people if they have beheaded this great man. He was seen as, the greatest champion of American values and principles and ideals in Europe. Yeah. Now, what does that do? Now that's going to raise people. There's people right now sitting there listening, I'm sure, or who are going to read this book that are going to say, oh my God, how can you say this about that evil terror, Napoleon Bonaparte? Folks, I haven't touched on this yet, but this is British propaganda, okay? These Napoleonic Wars, for example, there were 9 of them, I think. He only started one. And it was really because a treaty had been dishonored,
right,
and violated.
right.
8 of the 9 Napoleonic Wars were started by the British, and the British, Prussian, European coalition. The people whining and screaming about the Napoleonic Wars most were the ones who started them.
Right.
Okay. Napoleon, his system of law consolidated the ridiculous 42 different legal systems that existed in France alone back then, and the Napoleonic Code of Law to this day remains the basis of French law. Okay. Folks, when you go out and look at the addresses on the houses on your street, how we have odd numbers on one side, even on the other, that was Napoleon. That was a Napoleon Bonaparte, a civic code thing. Okay. There's so much that modern France still benefits from, and the modern West, that was stuff that Napoleon either came up with personally, or it was under his aegis of, his view and his vision. All this stuff you hear about him being murderous, that this is propaganda. And now people will point to, but what about Nostradamus and him being the Antichrist? Oh my God. Okay, here's the story on that. The guy who came up with that, who interpreted the Nostradamus stuff as, oh, this is about Napoleon and he's the second Antichrist. Okay, he's a guy that wasn't even a contemporary of Napoleon, obviously. It was long after Napoleon. But he based his, let me say this, he came up with, he created his thing based on translations of Nostradamus that were erroneous to begin with.
Right.
So all this stuff you hear about Napoleon Bonaparte being the second Antichrist, according to Nostradamus, it's baloney. It's BS. It's not. Nostradamus never said that about Napoleon.
Right.
The truth is that this man was brilliant. He had special gifts. He was well loved by people, even in the countries he conquered. Okay. It's because, along with this dynastic heritage that he had, it was because he was dedicated to the ideals of the Enlightenment. Okay. And you have to remember that England had just been embarrassed by the American Revolution. So they were really pissed about all this Enlightenment ideals of, freedom and liberty that were going through Europe or France at the time. And they were scared that Napoleon was the guy who was going to essentially Americanize
all of Europe.
Not in the way today with Coca-Cola and Mickey Mouse, but kind of enlightenize Europe, and they didn't like that.
Well, he certainly, by spreading the Napoleonic Code throughout Europe, he certainly makes the ultimate demise of those houses possible. And I don't think he'd have an 1848 revolution inside of Europe without it. And you certainly wouldn't have had the eventual unification of Germany without it, because he also got rid of a lot of the smaller German states and congealed them into larger masses, making it possible to unify. And
unfortunately, it was the Prussians who, were the hand making that happen.
Well, yeah, but the problem that the 1848 revolutions did was they were a direct strike against the oligarchical houses. And Napoleon also does something else, and that's he gets rid of the Holy Roman Empire, which was the basis in international law up to that point for a lot of these houses to claim some sort of residual power. So he totally turns Europe upside down. And I can easily see that your hypothesis about the British not wanting this guy to have a big country estate in England, even though it may have been Joseph Bonaparte and not Napoleon, that makes perfect sense to me, because that he's the last person that we would want in England.
From their perspective.
From their perspective, yeah.
And what you said is also, people can now better understand the source of this propaganda, folks,
right,
which has gone on for 200
years.
They have been desperate to paint this man into this monster, into this caricature, because the real Napoleon scared the hell out of them.
And they're still doing it, which means that there's something about that family that they're scared of. Volume 2. We're eagerly awaiting volume 2. All right. Well, I've taken about an hour and a half of your time. So what I want to do, Walter, before we sign off here, is when will it be ready for sale, and where will it be?
All my books print on demand at lulu.com, LULU.com, and I'm pretty confident that I can have it available by Sunday night.
Cool. Excellent.
If not Sunday, folks, by Monday, I'll have it available. But check.
Just keep Walter checking Bosley, Lulu.
Yeah, Esoteric Napoleon at lulu.com. Hey, check over the. I could get it in. Get it available sooner. It all depends on the load and everything. But I'm shooting for Sunday night.
Okay. Well, listen, my friend, doff my hat again. This is a. It's a fun read. I got to tell you, folks, it's a fun read. And the Secret Mission series, this is the capstone in the arch, folks. If you've been following the series, you'll want to get this book. Geiger in the chat room is asking me, could I link it on the site when you're ready? I will, Walter, if you'll give me a message, and I'll put it up on the website, on Facebook, and put it up in the forum.
Hey, I'm glad to finally reveal what it's about. For a year, I've held my tongue.
Oh, I am too. I've been biting the inside of my mouth, and it's now down to bloody stumps, because everybody, the questions, and I didn't take the questions tonight, guys, because they weren't on point. But I had to do it that way because I didn't want to reveal anything until he had the opportunity to tell us what the new book was about. But again, historical megatonnage, I love the methodology, the kind of intelligence analysis methodology of connecting dots and saying, no, that doesn't make sense. So this is a classic, folks. You're going to want to get it. And Walter, thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you. Because it's the first time I talked about it and it's so big, I apologize if I didn't do it justice. But I promise you guys will like the book.
Oh yeah, you definitely will like the book. You will definitely like the book. And Walter, thanks again for being on.
Thank you, Joseph.
All right. Bye-bye, my friend.
Bye.